The quiet hum of the London evening was broken only by the occasional rumble of a distant carriage, its wheels clattering over cobblestone streets. In a small, unassuming flat on the edge of Covent Garden, the police had gathered. Inspector Edward Craig, a sharp and diligent officer known for his methodical approach, stood over a table cluttered with papers and evidence. He stared down at a piece of parchment. His brow furrowed. There was a murder, but something about it was wrong. It didn't make sense. The victim, a middle-aged man by the name of Harold Harper, had been found in his study, an old-fashioned room lined with mahogany shelves full of leather-bound books. A solitary gas lamp flickered dimly by the door, casting long shadows over the scene. Harold Harper had been a quiet man, a loner by most accounts. No enemies, no debts. Yet, the circumstances surrounding his death were peculiar. The door to his study had been locked from the inside, and there was no sign of forced entry. The window, too, had been sealed tight. No one could have climbed in or out. In fact, the only unusual thing about the room was a small, perfectly round smudge of red ink on the back of a chair near the desk. The clue was trivial, but it had a strange symmetry. The ink splatter formed the shape of a question mark. It didn't fit the rest of the crime, as if it had been deliberately planted. If anything, it seemed as though the killer had left a riddle for someone to decipher. Inspector Craig had already questioned the household staff. A maid had found the body early that morning when she brought Harper his tea. None of the servants had seen anyone leave or enter the flat the previous night. No strange noises, no disturbances. Harper had dined alone. The only visitor had been his solicitor, who had arrived at precisely 7 in the evening, stayed for half an hour, and left without incident. There were no witnesses, and no real motive could be found. It was as though Harper's death had come out of nowhere. But now, standing in the middle of the room with only the eerie clue to go on, Craig felt the first stirrings of uncertainty. Something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He had been on many cases, but this one was different. It was too quiet, too perfect. This was no ordinary crime, and that was when he arrived. Detective Harlan Gray, a renowned investigator known for his unconventional methods and keen intellect, had been called in. The moment he stepped into the study, his presence seemed to change the atmosphere in the room. He moved with deliberate calm, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. The subtle shift in the air didn't escape him. There was something else here, hidden beneath the layers of apparent simplicity. "Inspector," Gray said, his voice cool, almost detached. "What can you tell me about the victim?" Craig gave a brief, tense summary of the facts, mentioning Harper's solitary life and the strange circumstances surrounding his death. He hesitated before adding the most perplexing detail: the red ink. Gray's lips curled into a faint smile as he approached the chair with the ink blot. He inspected it closely, then turned his attention to the desk, the bookshelves, the locked door, and the untouched window. Nothing was out of place. Nothing seemed wrong. Yet, in his experience, when everything appeared to be perfect, it often meant something was being overlooked. "Tell me," Gray said suddenly, "what was Harper's last known action?" Craig frowned, flipping through his notes. According to the staff, he was reading something at his desk before dinner. His solicitor, Mr. Edward Knox, came by. The two of them talked, and then Harper returned to his reading. No one knows what he was reading, though. Gray nodded slowly. The solicitor, Knox. "Does he have an alibi for the time of death?" "Apparently, yes. He was at a dinner party across town, and several witnesses saw him there." Gray stood still for a moment, processing the details. The solicitor was not the answer, nor was the ink blot, at least not directly. He had learned over the years that the most vital clues were often the ones that seemed completely irrelevant. That question mark, he murmured to himself. It's not just a clue, it's a signature. The room fell silent as Craig watched Gray in astonishment. The detective stepped away from the chair and walked towards the desk, his eyes lingering on a letter left half open. It was a strange thing, one of those letters where the meaning felt slightly off, as though words were deliberately avoided. "This," Gray continued, "isn't an ordinary murder. It's a message." He looked up at Craig. "The killer is still here." At that moment, Craig felt the room tense. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he realized what Gray was implying. The killer hadn't left, not yet. They were standing in the exact place where the crime had occurred. But what was left behind wasn't a body, it was a clue to something much larger. Something more twisted. Gray motioned for the inspector to follow him. He led Craig to the back of the room, where a bookshelf had been shifted slightly. Behind it, they discovered a small, concealed door, hidden in plain sight. The detective's eyes gleamed. I suspected as much. Behind the door was a narrow passageway that led to another room, smaller, dimmer, inside. They found something that chilled Craig to his core, a journal. It was Harper's, filled with cryptic, disjointed notes. The final entry read, "I have been here for days now, and no one knows, no one cares. The stranger still watches, and I will never leave this room, no matter how I try. No one will ever know the truth." Gray flipped through the pages with practiced speed. The last sentence stuck with him, its meaning clear now. Harold Harper had not been murdered. He had disappeared into a place of his own making, locked himself away. His death was a staged performance, one designed to confuse and bewilder anyone who came searching for answers. The stranger mentioned in the journal. It was a symbolic reference to the man who had never left the room. The case was far from over. The mystery had only deepened. But Gray knew one thing for sure. The crime that seemed unsolvable was a deliberate puzzle, and the answers were waiting to be uncovered, one twisted piece at a time. The room had a stagnant, oppressive air as Craig and Gray stood in the hidden chamber, surrounded by the faint scent of dust and old leather. The journal had only deepened the mystery, yet it seemed like another puzzle piece, one that led them further into the labyrinth of secrets Harper had left behind. But there was something about this room that was unsettling, something Craig couldn't quite place. Gray's steady, almost unnerving calm only heightened the tension. The detective's gaze shifted back to the journal as he flipped through the remaining pages, each one revealing more of Harper's cryptic thoughts. But none of them provided any immediate clarity. It was only when Gray paused on the last page, his finger lightly touching a scribbled line, that Craig finally saw the first real crack in the facade. "This," Gray said quietly, as though speaking more to himself than to Craig, "is the moment the story changes." Harper knew something. He was involved in something far darker than anyone realized. Craig leaned in, trying to understand the significance. The last entry contained nothing more than a frantic series of scrawls, names, dates, and one cryptic sentence: "The stranger will return, but not in the way you think." "The stranger?" Craig echoed, his mind racing. But before he could voice any more questions, Gray had already turned on his heel, his eyes scanning the room as though the walls themselves might have something to reveal. "I need to speak with Mr. Knox," Gray said, his voice suddenly more assertive. "Where is he?" Craig hesitated, startled by the shift in Gray's demeanor. "The solicitor. He's likely still at his office. He left immediately after the meeting." "As I said before, we're going to his office," Gray replied, already moving towards the door. "He knows more than he's letting on." The two of them left the study, the muffled sounds of the investigation continuing behind them. Craig's mind was still clouded, thoughts swirling between the journal, the mysterious ink blot, and the peculiar passageway. But despite his confusion, one thing became clear. Harold Harper's murder was not a random act of violence. It was part of something far bigger, something much more calculated. The cab ride to Edward Knox's office was a quiet one, the streets bathed in the muted glow of gas lamps. Craig, who had been following Gray's lead without question, couldn't help but wonder about the detective's strange calm. How was it that Gray had managed to draw so much from the journal, without so much as a hint of doubt? Craig had worked many cases before, but this was different. There was no obvious suspect, no discernible motive. Yet, Gray had already unearthed a pattern. When they arrived at the solicitor's office, it was nearly empty, save for a few clerks working late into the night. The building was quiet, save for the shuffle of papers and the sound of distant conversation. Gray walked ahead, his footsteps purposeful, his eyes scanning every corner of the room as though searching for something that wasn't there. Knox's secretary, a middle-aged woman with an expression as sharp as her spectacles, greeted them with a polite but wary smile. "May I help you, gentlemen? We're here to see Mr. Knox," Gray said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Is he available?" The secretary's smile faltered for a moment before she nodded. "Mr. Knox is finishing a few matters in his office. I'll notify him you're here." She turned and left, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Gray remained still, his eyes fixed on the walls, the hallway, the faint creak of floorboards. Craig felt the pressure of the moment, the tension creeping in, but he couldn't quite figure out what made the air feel so heavy. Moments later, Mr. Edward Knox emerged from behind a door at the end of the corridor. He was tall, with graying hair and a well-groomed mustache. His face was courteous, but there was an unmistakable wariness in his eyes when he saw Gray. He stepped forward, extending a hand. "Detective Gray," Knox greeted, though his voice was cool. "What brings you to my office?" Gray shook his hand with barely any pressure, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed Knox. "I'd like to ask you a few questions regarding the death of Harold Harper." Knox's eyebrows lifted, but his demeanor didn't change. "Harold Harper, of course. I read about it in the papers. Quite the tragic incident. I can't imagine how such a thing could happen." "Indeed," Gray replied, his voice neutral, but unwavering. "And yet, we've found some interesting details that suggest otherwise." Knox's face remained composed, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a slight stiffening of his shoulders. "I'm afraid I'm not following." "Detective." Gray's sharp eyes flicked over Knox's office, noting the stacks of papers on the desk, the portraits hanging on the walls. He took in every detail as though each object held significance. "Tell me, Mr. Knox," Gray began, his voice calm but insistent, "when did you last see Harold Harper?" Knox hesitated for a moment, but then answered with practiced ease. "As I mentioned, we met for a short discussion the evening before his death. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just a few business matters. And did you notice anything unusual during your meeting?" Gray pressed. Knox seemed taken aback by the question. "Unusual? No, not at all. We spoke for about half an hour. I left promptly afterward." He seemed his usual self. Gray's eyes never left him as he continued. "And yet, we've discovered something very peculiar, Mr. Knox. You see, Harold Harper wasn't just a simple client. He was deeply involved in something darker. It's clear now that Harper's life, while ordinary on the surface, was anything but." The mention of something darker caused Knox to stiffen, his fingers twitching ever so slightly. He took a step back, his face paling. I don't know what you mean." Gray's gaze sharpened, and for the first time, Craig could feel the tension hanging in the room. Something had shifted. Knox was hiding something, and the detective had spotted it. "I believe you do," Gray replied softly, but with a coldness that made the air feel even thicker. "You knew Harper well enough to understand that he was involved in something he wasn't telling anyone, something that led him to lock himself in that study, all alone. And I have to wonder how much of it did you know?" The words hung between them like a loaded gun. Knox's face contorted briefly, and for a fleeting moment, Craig saw something flicker in his eyes, an emotion too quick to pin down, but unmistakable in its intensity. Double quotes, "Mr. Knox," Gray pressed, his voice steady. "I'm afraid we're at a crossroads. You can either help us find the truth, or I can continue pulling at the strings until they unravel." For the first time since they arrived, Knox seemed unsure. His jaw tightened, and his fingers drummed nervously against the arm of his chair. He looked as though he might speak, but nothing came out, and in that silence, Gray waited. The room grew heavier with each passing second, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken challenge. Knox was still standing by the window, his back turned, eyes scanning the darkened streets beyond. The detective's words had clearly unsettled him, though he was doing his best to mask it. Craig could feel the tension in the air, a palpable force that made every word hang with significance. Gray, however, remained unfazed. His eyes were sharp, calculating, as though he could see the fine thread of lies weaving through the space around them. He had yet to make a direct accusation, but Knox's discomfort spoke volumes. Craig was starting to see it to the cracks in the facade. The solicitor's polished professionalism, his calm demeanor, seemed increasingly hollow. There was more to this man's involvement than he was letting on. After what seemed like an eternity, Knox turned slowly, his expression strained, but composed. "I must admit, Detective, I'm not sure what you mean by all this. You're suggesting that I have something to do with Harold's death." His voice was slightly too controlled, a hint of defensiveness creeping in. Gray didn't flinch. "I'm suggesting that you know more than you've said. You were his solicitor, Mr. Knox. You had access to his affairs, to his secrets." He let the words sink in before continuing. "But your reaction just now says there's something you're afraid of." Knox inhaled sharply, the color draining from his face. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles whitening. "I assure you, Detective, I am not the one hiding anything." Gray's eyes narrowed slightly, and he took a step forward, his voice lowering. "Then why the hesitation, Mr. Knox? Why the sudden change in demeanor?" Knox's gaze flickered, a brief, almost imperceptible look of panic flashing across his face. For a second, it felt like the walls were closing in. But then, just as quickly, the mask of professionalism slipped back into place. He cleared his throat, straightening his tie as if trying to gather himself. "I don't appreciate the insinuations, Detective, but if it's truly necessary, I will cooperate fully. I have nothing to hide." His voice was firm, but there was a noticeable edge to it. Gray gave him a measured look, his eyes piercing, before he spoke again, his tone almost conversational. "You'll have to do more than just talk, Mr. Knox. You'll need to prove it. And I have a feeling we'll be asking you a lot of questions in the days to come." Knox stiffened, but he said nothing more. Gray's words hung in the air like a challenge. Craig glanced at the detective, who was already moving toward the door. Without a word, Gray nodded toward him, signaling that it was time to go. As they exited Knox's office and stepped into the dimly lit hallway, Craig couldn't shake the feeling that they were circling something far darker than a mere murder. The solicitor's reaction, his slip of composure, it was all too telling. But what was he hiding? "Let's speak to the staff," Gray said abruptly, breaking the silence as they descended the stairs. "We need to find out what they know about Harper's behavior in the days leading up to his death." The staff was small to housekeepers, a cook, and a young maid who had discovered the body. Each of them had their own version of events. But as they questioned them one by one, a pattern began to emerge. The first housekeeper, Mrs. Price, was an older woman with a sharp eye and a no-nonsense attitude. She spoke candidly, but there was something uneasy in her voice, something she wasn't saying. "I saw Mr. Harper the night before, round dinner," she explained, her hands trembling slightly as she folded a napkin. "He was agitated, restless, pacing back and forth, but he didn't want to talk about it. When I asked, he just said he had a bad feeling about something, but wouldn't go into detail." Craig exchanged a glance with Gray. A bad feeling, it wasn't much to go on, but it felt significant. The cook, a stout man named Mr. Harding, seemed much more eager to cooperate, almost too eager. He spoke quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "I don't know much, sir, but I can tell you this. Mr. Harper had a visitor, a man tall, with dark hair and a long coat. Came around 7, left at 8. They talked for a bit, but I didn't hear much. Mr. Harper was, well, he was on edge, I'd say." "Did you see this man clearly?" Gray asked, his voice calm but probing. Harding scratched his head, looking uncertain. "Not really. Just saw him in passing. I was busy in the kitchen, you know. But he was different. Something about him felt off." Craig leaned forward slightly. "And this man, did he seem like someone Mr. Harper knew well?" Harding hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, they seemed familiar with each other. But I don't know who he was. Never saw him before. Not around here." Gray exchanged a look with Craig. This was starting to feel like a dead end, but something about Harding's eagerness, his quickness to share, felt forced. There was a hint of something off in his words, but no concrete proof to follow. The last person they spoke with was Clara, the maid who had found the body. She was young, and her face was pale as she recounted the morning's discovery. "I didn't see anyone leave. Not the night before. I was up early with the breakfast tray. I didn't think much of it. I knocked, but when he didn't answer, I opened the door, and that's when I saw." Her voice cracked. And she choked on the words. Craig stepped closer, trying to offer some comfort, but Gray was already sharp-eyed, watching the girl's every movement. "Clara," Gray said gently, "we understand this is difficult, but I need you to think clearly. Did you notice anything unusual? Anything at all?" The girl swallowed, her eyes darting nervously to the door, as if expecting someone to walk in. I thought I saw something out in the study," she said. Hesitantly, "A book was missing from the shelf. I didn't say anything at the time, because I thought I was mistaken." Craig raised an eyebrow. "A book was missing," Clara nodded, her gaze shifting nervously. "Yes, it was a thick, red-covered book. I can't remember the title, but it wasn't there when I looked, and when I went to find it later, it was back. I didn't tell anyone, because I thought it was just my imagination." But Gray's eyes sharpened. A missing book. That was more than a simple detail. It could be the key. He looked at Craig, who nodded in understanding. "Where did you find it?" Gray asked, his voice clipped. Clara's face flushed. "I'm not sure. It was in the study again, right where it should be, on the shelf. But it wasn't there when I first looked. I swear." "It wasn't. Thank you, Clara," Gray said, his voice softening slightly. That was important. As they left the maid, Craig felt the weight of the moment press down on him. There were so many contradictions, so many half-formed stories. The missing book, Harding's nervousness, Clara's odd memory, each one of them was a small thread. But together they began to weave a troubling picture. Someone was hiding something. The question was, who and why? Gray's expression was unreadable, but Craig could see the detective was already putting the pieces together. They had to go back to the study, back to where the first clue had been left behind. Something was still there, waiting to be uncovered. The weight of the investigation was beginning to settle heavily on Craig's shoulders. Each thread, each suspect, each alibi was drawing him deeper into a maze of motives, each more complex and contradictory than the last. It was becoming clear that no one was entirely innocent, yet no one seemed fully guilty either. Everyone had a reason to be involved, but no one had a clear answer. And Gray, he seemed to be playing a game with the truth, piecing it together slowly, deliberately. As if savoring the unraveling mystery, they had returned to the study, the place where it all began. The room was just as they had left it, though it now felt colder, as if the walls themselves were bearing witness to the secrets hidden within. Gray was already moving about, his fingers lightly brushing over the spines of the books on the shelf. Craig watched him, still unsure of how much Gray had already deduced. The detective's calm exterior masked a mind that was always calculating, always several steps ahead. "I think we're missing something," Gray muttered to himself, pulling down a few books at random and inspecting their spines. He didn't say more, but Craig could feel the sharpness in his tone. The hunt was on. Gray moved with an almost eerie precision, his fingers tapping against the wood of the desk. "The book," he finally said, looking over his shoulder at Craig. "Clara mentioned it, red cover, missing, and then returned. It wasn't just misplaced. It was hidden." Craig frowned. "You think the missing book is connected to the murder?" "It's more than a book," Gray replied, stepping toward the desk. "It's the symbol. Look at this room, Craig. It's too neat, too perfect. Harper wasn't someone who would leave a book lying around, let alone misplace it. He was meticulous, almost obsessive. The book was moved for a reason." Craig nodded slowly, trying to wrap his mind around what Gray was implying. But who would take it, and why return it? "That," Gray said with a glint in his eye, "is exactly what we need to find out." Gray's gaze moved to the desk, where a letter was half hidden under a stack of papers. Craig hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to draw him in like a magnet. It was folded in a way that was slightly out of place, as if someone had hurriedly tucked it away. Craig opened it, scanning the contents quickly. It was a letter from Mr. Knox Harold Harper's solicitor. The words were carefully crafted, but there was a subtle underlying tension in the way they were written, almost like a coded message. "I'll need to ask Knox about this," Craig said, his voice low. Gray glanced at the letter, then at Craig. "Yes, but I believe we've already been down that road. Knox is hiding something, but he's not the only one." Craig hesitated. "You think one of the staff is involved?" "Not involved, manipulated," Gray replied. Someone planted seeds of distrust, and now the threads are twisting. We've spoken with them, but we haven't looked at the bigger picture yet. We're too focused on the individuals. We need to understand the relationships, the connections. It's a web, Craig, a tangled one. The detective's words rang in Craig's ears, each syllable making the puzzle pieces click into place. The more he thought about it, the more Craig realized that the key wasn't any single person. It was their relationships with one another. Who had the most to gain from Harper's death? Who had the opportunity to manipulate the others? Their first stop was the housekeeper, Mrs. Price. She had been the one who noticed Harper's unease before his death, and there had been something about her story that felt off, as though she was hiding something. When they arrived at her modest flat, she greeted them with a forced smile. Her hands were still slightly shaking, though she quickly hid them behind her apron. She motioned for them to sit at the small kitchen table, and Craig could tell she was doing everything she could to maintain control. "We've been through this already," she said, her voice a little too steady. "I told you everything I know. We believe there's more," Gray said calmly. "Something you haven't mentioned. Mrs. Price, you were in the house when the solicitor came, weren't you?" She stiffened at the mention of Knox's name, but quickly composed herself. I didn't see anything unusual, if that's what you mean." Gray didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced around the small kitchen, as if searching for something hidden in plain sight. Then his eyes flicked back to Mrs. Price, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. "It's strange," Gray said, his voice smooth. "For someone so attentive, you seem to have missed an important detail. Mr. Harper was in poor health, wasn't he? You've mentioned before that he seemed unusually frail of late." Mrs. Price's face tightened. "He had his ups and downs." "Yes, but he wasn't ill, if that's what you mean. He just had a lot on his mind." Craig noticed how she shifted uneasily in her seat, her gaze flickering to the window. And for the first time, he saw the crack in her composure. She was hiding something. But what? "What exactly did you mean by a lot on his mind, Mrs. Price?" Craig asked, pressing further. She hesitated, and Craig could see her trying to decide whether or not to speak. Harold. Harold was troubled, and there was someone he was worried about. Someone who had been after him for some time. "Who?" Gray asked, his voice quiet but insistent. Mrs. Price swallowed hard. "I don't know for sure, but I heard things, whispers." She lowered her voice, as if afraid someone might overhear. "He was scared, said someone was coming to claim what was his. He'd been receiving strange letters. And well, there was something about the solicitor. He'd been acting odd, too." Gray leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. On how she looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know, but after the solicitor came, Harold was different, more paranoid. It was like he was preparing for something that wasn't good." The detective's eyes glinted with realization. This was the piece they'd been missing. The suspicion about Knox wasn't just rooted in Harper's behavior. There was something more, a debt, a secret deal. "Do you think Mr. Knox was blackmailing Harper?" Craig asked, the thought forming in his mind. Mrs. Price shook her head, but the doubt in her eyes betrayed her. "I don't know, but Harold, he never seemed the same after the last meeting." Gray exchanged a glance with Craig. Everything pointed toward the solicitor, but the more they dug, the less clear the picture became. It wasn't just one man. It wasn't even just one motive. The greed, the fear, the jealousy, it all mixed together in a way that made it impossible to separate the truth from the lies. "Thank you, Mrs. Price," Gray said, his voice soft but firm. "I think we've gathered all we can hear." As they left her flat, Craig felt the weight of the case pressing down on him. Each piece of information only seemed to complicate things further. The more they discovered, the harder it became to figure out who was telling the truth and who was lying. And the worst part, everyone had a reason to be involved: greed, revenge, jealousy, fear. The maze of motives was growing more tangled, and at the center of it all was one question: who truly wanted Harold Harper dead? The case seemed to be shifting in their favor. A breakthrough, an elusive, almost elusive one, had finally fallen into their laps. It came in the form of an old ledger, discovered buried beneath a pile of forgotten papers in Harper's study. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink smudged and faded, but the details were unmistakable. There, in black and white, were transactions, large sums of money, paid out in secrecy, sent to an overseas account under the name of one person, Edward Knox. For a moment, Craig's heart raced. This was it, wasn't it? The motive, the connection, it all pointed straight to the solicitor. The tension that had been building in the investigation seemed to snap into place. It all made sense now. Knox had been involved in something far darker than anyone could have guessed. The money, the mysterious letters, the strange behavior, it all pointed to blackmail, to extortion, to a crime so tightly wound in secrecy that it had finally unraveled. Gray had been quiet through all of this, but his eyes had narrowed as he examined the ledger. He hadn't made any immediate moves, no urgent calls to the authorities. He had simply stood there, staring at the numbers, calculating, like a man who was still a few steps ahead of everyone else. This is it, Craig had said, feeling the rush of triumph. We've got him, Gray. This ledger, this proves everything. The money, the dealings. Knox was blackmailing Harper. This was never about money, it was about control. Harper had something Knox wanted, and now we have the proof. Gray's lips had twitched, his expression a careful mask of thoughtfulness. It's a good lead, Craig. A very good one. But his voice had carried an unsettling quality, a kind of measured hesitation that Craig couldn't quite place. The more Craig studied the ledger, the more his own certainty began to grow. This wasn't just the solution, it was the solution. The following days were a whirlwind. With the evidence in hand, the authorities scrambled to tie up the case. A warrant was issued, and Knox was brought in for questioning. The media buzzed with excitement, the headlines practically writing themselves. Solicitor at the center of Harper's death. The arrest seemed like a formality. Even the staff, including Mrs. Price and Mr. Harding, were willing to testify that Harper had been scared, that his last days had been filled with fear of something, a person, perhaps. Everything lined up, everything seemed perfect. But as Gray stood there, watching it all unfold, a quiet suspicion continued to gnaw at him. He didn't voice it outright, but Craig saw it in his eyes, the same keen, analytical gaze that never seemed to miss a thing. The detective was still working the angles in his mind, still piecing together the web that everyone else was so eager to declare as solved. Something doesn't sit right, Gray murmured as they stood by the window of the station's observation room, watching Knox being led away in handcuffs. The solicitor's face was a mask of indifference, but the tension in his jaw told a different story. Craig turned to him, eyebrows raised. What are you saying? We have the evidence, Gray, the ledger, the transactions Knox was blackmailing. Harper, it's clear. I know what the evidence shows, Gray replied, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of unspoken doubt. But evidence isn't always the truth. It's a piece of the puzzle. But we don't have the whole picture yet. Craig was about to argue when the door to the room opened, and a constable stepped in. Detective Gray, there's a phone call. For you, it's urgent. Gray didn't hesitate. I'll take it in my office. Without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving Craig standing there, feeling the strange coldness that had settled over him. The victory was too easy, too clean. The pieces had fallen into place too perfectly. Craig tried to push the doubt from his mind, but it lingered like an unwanted shadow, growing stronger with each passing minute. It wasn't until the following morning that the first crack in their case appeared. Gray had been pacing in his office, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an almost frantic energy. When he looked up at Craig with a gaze that was sharp, focused. "The ledger is a red herring," he said, his voice low but certain. Craig blinked, unable to comprehend at first. "What are you talking about? We've got Knox dead to rights." "The ledger, I know," Gray interrupted. "I know what it looks like. But there's something off about the transactions, Craig. Too neat, too convenient. It was planted." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, and for a moment, Craig could barely make sense of them. He felt the ground shift beneath him, his previous certainty crumbling like dry leaves. "Planted? You think Knox planted it?" "No, not Knox." Gray's eyes gleamed with an unsettling clarity. "Someone else. Someone who wanted us to think Knox was guilty. Someone who wanted us to rush to judgment." Craig's mind raced, trying to catch up. But who? Why? And what does that have to do with Harper's death? Gray gave him a long, measured look, as if weighing how much to reveal. Think about it, Craig. Knox was being blackmailed, sure, but was he really the only one with something to hide? What if the ledger wasn't about Harper's secrets? What if it was about someone else's? Craig stood still, suddenly feeling the weight of the case shift. Everything that had seemed so certain now seemed open to interpretation. You're saying the real culprit isn't Knox? No, Gray said, his voice steady. I'm saying that someone is framing him. They knew we would follow the money, follow the paper trail. It's not about what's written in the ledger, it's about what's not in it. Not in it, Craig echoed, his thoughts scrambling to keep up. Gray nodded, his expression grim. We've been looking at the wrong person, Craig. The real criminal hasn't been caught yet, and they're still out there. It was as if a veil had been lifted from Craig's eyes. The breakthrough they thought they had was a mirage, nothing more than a diversion. The truth was still shrouded in mystery, hidden beneath layers of deception. The closer they thought they were to the end, the farther they seemed from it. The game was far from over. Where do we go from here? Craig asked, his voice thick with realization. We need to go back to the beginning, Gray replied, his eyes hardening with resolve. We need to question everything we think we know. Someone in this web of lies is still pulling the strings, and it's time we figured out who. Gray turned and moved toward the door, his mind already racing ahead, calculating the next steps. Craig followed, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. They had won a victory, but it was a hollow one. The real criminal was still out there, waiting in the shadows, and the truth was slipping further and further away. The case was at a standstill, but Gray seemed unbothered by the sudden twist. Craig, however, felt the weight of their failure pressing on him. They'd been so close yet now. The pieces they thought fit together had proven false, and the answers they'd clung to now seemed like little more than mirages. He couldn't help but feel the cold sting of uncertainty creeping in, but Gray's mind never stopped moving. The detective was already thinking several steps ahead, the gears in his head whirring as he silently processed every element of the case. The morning after their latest conversation, Gray called Craig into his office early. The detective sat at his desk, the dim light from the window casting long shadows across the room. There were piles of case files, newspaper clippings, and notes scattered about, a visual testament to the mental maze Gray was traversing. I've been thinking, Gray began, tapping a finger against the edge of a file. We've been looking at this case all wrong. It's not just about the present. The murder of Harold Harper has roots in the past, roots we've overlooked. And in that past lies the real key to this whole thing. Craig's eyes narrowed as he processed the words, the past. What do you mean? Gray's gaze flicked to the top of a particular file, one that Craig had overlooked in the flood of details. Remember the case from 2 years ago, the disappearance of Richard Collier? The name struck Craig like a bolt. He blinked, the memory clicking into place. Richard Collier, an unsolved case that had slipped into the background, overshadowed by more high-profile crimes. Collier had been a wealthy businessman, last seen leaving his office late one evening. His body was never found, and the police had no evidence to link anyone to his disappearance. His case had gone cold, but for some reason, it had always stuck. With Gray, Craig's brow furrowed. I remember. But what does that have to do with Harper's death? Everything, Gray said softly. I believe that Harper was involved in Collier's disappearance. I think he was a witness or worse. An accomplice? Craig's mind raced. It was a theory that seemed far-fetched at first, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Both men were wealthy, influential, and from the same circles. If Harper had been involved in some way with Collier, it could explain the fear Harper had experienced in his final days, the strange behavior, and the secrecy surrounding his life. But it also raised more questions. Why hadn't Harper come forward if he knew something about Collier's disappearance? Craig said slowly, are you suggesting that Harper was covering something up? That he was involved in Collier's disappearance? I'm suggesting that Harper knew something, Gray replied, his voice steady, eyes sharp, and that knowledge put him in someone's crosshairs. We've been looking at Harper's own life, his relationships, his fears, but we never considered what happened before. We need to find out who else knew about Collier's disappearance. Who might have wanted to silence Harper before he could talk? The detective was already moving, gathering the files they had on Collier. Craig followed, still processing the connections Gray was drawing. It was the breakthrough they needed, but it felt like the deeper they dug, the darker the world they were uncovering became. Gray skimmed through the old case files, pulling out a series of photographs of Collier's last known whereabouts. There was a picture of him leaving his office, and beside it, a blurry photo of someone walking out behind him. The face was partially obscured, but there was something familiar about the posture. Gray stared at the photo for a long moment before setting it down on the desk. "This man," Gray said, pointing to the figure in the background. "He looks too familiar. It's not just the walk, it's the shoulders, the stance. This is someone we know, Craig. Someone who was close to both Collier and Harper." Craig leaned in, studying the photograph. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. There was something about the figure in the photo that struck him. But it wasn't until Gray reached for another file that the connection clicked. "You're thinking of Knox," Craig said, his voice low with realization. Gray's eyes gleamed with a knowing look. "Exactly, Edward Knox. He was Collier's solicitor as well, just like he was Harper's. We never considered that Collier's disappearance might have anything to do with Harper's death. But now it seems clear Knox was involved with both of them. He was the one pulling the strings." It was a revelation that left Craig momentarily speechless. He had been so focused on the ledger and the money trail, the blackmail, that he hadn't seen the bigger picture. Knox wasn't just the solicitor of a man in fear. He was the link between the mysterious disappearances. But why and how did Harper fit into it all? "We need to dig deeper into Knox's history," Gray said, standing up. "He's been decleaned for too long. The connections between these two cases are real, but we still don't know the full extent of them." Craig nodded, already feeling the weight of the next step in the investigation. "So, we go back to Knox, find out what he's been hiding." But as they prepared to leave, Gray stopped, his hand resting on the doorframe. "There's one more thing, Craig. We're not the only ones digging around in the past." Craig turned, confused by the sudden shift in Gray's tone. The detective's eyes were hard, focused. "The people involved in Collier's disappearance, they're still out there. And they know we're getting closer. We have to be careful. Knox may not be the only one who's dangerous." A shiver ran down Craig's spine. The case had taken a sharp turn. And now it wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about surviving long enough to do so. The detective's words weighed heavily on him as they made their way out of the office. It wasn't just the present that was threatening them. The shadows of the past had finally caught up, and the criminals they were chasing were not only hiding in plain sight, they were waiting, watching, ready to strike again. The deeper they delved into the lives of Harold Harper and Richard Collier, the more Craig understood. This case wasn't just about a murder. It was about a buried history of greed, betrayal, and lies that stretched far beyond anything they had initially imagined. And somewhere in the shadows, the real criminals were still pulling strings, waiting for their moment to strike. The cold edge of the morning pressed into Craig's bones as he stepped out of the office, the weight of the case hanging heavy on his shoulders. They had gathered all the pieces they thought they needed: the ledger, the mysterious connection to Richard Collier, and the unsettling ties that linked Knox to both men. Yet despite the flurry of activity and mounting evidence, something still gnawed at Craig's gut, a suspicion that they were still missing something. It was as if the case was teasing them, offering glimpses of the truth without ever fully revealing it. Gray, however, was calm as ever. He had never shown signs of fatigue, but this morning there was a sharpness to his eyes that felt like a challenge. He was thinking, always thinking, and Craig could see that the detective was formulating a plan, one that, unlike anything before, was a calculated risk. "We need to speak with Knox again," Gray said, his voice quiet but filled with purpose. "But not in the usual way. We're going to test him." Craig blinked. "Test him? What do you mean?" Gray's lips curled slightly into something akin to a smile. But it wasn't one of amusement, it was the kind of smile a chess player gives when they've maneuvered their opponent into check. "We've been asking Knox the wrong questions. We've been too focused on the obvious. This time, We're going to force him to reveal himself. We need to test his reactions, his instincts, not just his answers." Craig raised an eyebrow, the unease creeping back into his chest. "How exactly do you plan on doing that?" Gray's gaze turned to the window, his expression unreadable. "We'll give him something he wasn't expecting, something personal. Something that forces him to show his true colors. You're going to watch him, Craig. You'll see it when it happens." They spent the next few hours preparing, and Craig couldn't help but feel an unsettling thrill run through him. The tension was building, and he knew the moment had arrived. They were walking a fine line now, an edge where their investigation could veer into danger. But Gray's confidence was contagious, and for the first time in days, Craig felt a flicker of hope. When they arrived at Knox's office, the solicitor was sitting behind his desk, looking as composed as ever. His posture was perfect, his suit sharp, and his demeanor calm, a stark contrast to the nervous energy Craig felt bubbling under the surface. It was clear that Knox was preparing for whatever accusations might come. But Gray was playing a different game. The door clicked shut behind them, and Knox looked up with a practiced smile. "Detective Gray, Detective Craig. How can I help you today?" Gray gave him a measured nod. "We're not here for the usual questioning today, Mr. Knox. We've come to talk about something more personal." Craig could see Knox stiffen at the mention of the word personal, but he did well to mask it with a courteous expression. "Personal," Knox echoed, his voice smooth, but with an edge of wariness creeping in. "Yes," Gray said, his voice deliberate. "There's something we discovered in the course of our investigation. A piece of information we thought you might find interesting." He set a manila envelope on the desk, sliding it across toward Knox. Knox's eyes flicked down to the envelope, his hand hovering above it for a moment before he reluctantly reached out to open it. Craig watched closely, noting the way Knox's fingers trembled just slightly. It was a small thing, easily dismissed, but Craig's instincts told him it was significant. Inside the envelope were several photographs, some of Knox and Harper, but others were of a different man, someone Craig didn't recognize. They were old photos, faded and yellowing at the edges, clearly taken years ago. At first glance, they seemed like nothing more than personal snapshots. But there was one that caught Knox's eye, a picture of a young Harper standing beside the man in question. Both were wearing suits. But it wasn't just the image that drew Knox's attention, it was the look on Harper's face. The unease, the discomfort. It was a look Craig had seen before, just before Harper's death. Knox's fingers paused over the photographs, his eyes scanning them with a quickness that seemed rehearsed. "Where did you find these?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp. His posture stiffening, Gray leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "That's not important. What matters is that these photos link you to someone we believe might be connected to Collier's disappearance. We've been looking into your past, Mr. Knox, and these photos suggest a history one you didn't disclose." The color drained from Knox's face, but it wasn't the fear that Craig had expected. It wasn't guilt, it was anger, pure, unfiltered anger. Knox slammed the photographs back onto the desk, his fingers gripping the edges tightly. As his voice came out in a low growl, "You have no right to bring these into this. I've told you everything I know." Gray didn't flinch. He remained calm, his eyes steady. "Tell me, Mr. Knox, what is it that you're so afraid of? Is it the past, or is it something else entirely?" Knox's eyes darted to the door, as if searching for an escape, but he knew he couldn't leave, not without making a scene, not without drawing attention. He wasn't afraid of the detective, he was afraid of something far deeper, something older than any of the questions they had asked him so far. Craig noticed the shift in the air. There was something in Knox's eyes, a flicker of recognition, a crack in the wall he had so carefully constructed. It wasn't just the photos, it was the way Knox had reacted to them. This wasn't just about Collier or Harper. It was about something else entirely, something that Knox had buried, locked away in a vault of secrets for years. "We could sit here and keep talking in circles, Mr. Knox," Gray said, his voice a calm contrast to the solicitor's growing frustration. "But you know as well as I do that we're not here to play games. These pictures aren't just old memories, they're the link between your past and your present. The question is, how much longer are you going to try and hide what happened? For a long moment, Knox remained silent. His fingers trembled again as they hovered over the photos. It was a simple act, nothing more than a man trying to control his nerves, but it was a crack, one that couldn't be ignored. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Knox said finally, his voice tight, barely a whisper. "But you don't know what you're getting into." Gray's eyes never left his. "Don't we? Or is it you who doesn't know what you're up against?" The silence in the room was thick with tension, but Knox didn't respond. He couldn't, because he knew deep down that Gray had already won. The detective's subtle manipulation, his understanding of Knox's psyche, had forced the solicitor to reveal something he wasn't prepared to. It wasn't the truth yet, but it was the beginning of it. As they left Knox's office, Craig couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface. The real deception wasn't in the photos, in the ledger, or in the answers Knox had given. It was in his reaction, the anger, the panic, the slip of control. There was more to uncover, more buried beneath the surface. But one thing was certain. Now, the cracks were starting to show, and this time, the truth was going to come out. The quiet hum of the office was broken only by the tapping of Gray's pen against the desk. He had his gaze fixed on the files before him, but Craig knew that behind those calculating eyes, the detective was still running through their last conversation with Knox. The solicitor's anger had been reel to reel, and the cracks in his composed facade hadn't gone unnoticed. Gray knew they were onto something Knox was desperate to bury, but as the hours passed, the pieces still weren't falling into place. They were missing a vital link. For the first time in days, Craig had the feeling that the case was starting to slip through their fingers. He sat across from Gray, the silence between them thickening. But before he could voice his concerns, the phone on Gray's desk rang, piercing the tension. Gray picked it up without hesitation, his sharp attention never wavering. He listened. For a moment, his face unreadable. "Understood," he finally said, hanging up. He set the phone down slowly, his fingers tapping against the receiver as if deep in thought. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low. Craig felt a rush of adrenaline. "What's happened?" "The photos, the ones we showed Knox," Gray continued, his eyes narrowing. "They're gone, taken from the evidence locker. Someone broke in during the night." Craig's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, taken? How?" Gray leaned back in his chair, his gaze hardening. "Someone knew exactly where to look. Whoever did this wasn't just after the photos, they were after the connection between Knox and Collier. The files have been tampered with, and whoever it is covering their tracks. This wasn't random, Craig. It was deliberate." A sickening feeling twisted in Craig's gut. They had come so far only to have it ripped from their grasp. The realization set in. Someone was actively working against them, erasing their progress piece by piece. It wasn't just about the photos. It was about everything they had uncovered. The person who had stolen the evidence was trying to bury the truth. "How do we know it's someone inside the station?" Craig asked, his mind racing through possible scenarios. Gray's eyes flickered to the door, then back at Craig. "Because the only other key holder to that locker is one of our own. The break-in happened overnight, and the footage is conveniently corrupted. It was either erased or altered." Craig clenched his fists. "So, someone here, one of us, is helping the person who doesn't want us to find out the truth." Gray nodded, his face grim. "That's the problem. Trust is a fragile thing right now." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. The walls, which had always seemed like solid boundaries, now felt oppressive, like they were closing in. Craig wasn't sure who he could trust anymore. They had already been walking a fine line with Knox, and now, someone within their own ranks was undermining everything they'd worked for, every piece of evidence, every lead. They were all vulnerable. Gray's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "We need to go back to Knox, but this time, we can't just ask questions. We need to put pressure on him. Someone else is pulling the strings, and I believe he knows more than he's letting on. If he's hiding something, we need to push him harder." The detective's words cut through the panic, bringing Craig back to the task at hand. They couldn't afford to let this derail them. They had to stay focused. When they arrived at Knox's office, the solicitor was waiting for them, as if he had anticipated their return. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there the first time they met. His smile, once polished, now seemed forced, his eyes a little too sharp. Back again so soon. Gentlemen? Knox's voice was smooth, but Craig could hear the underlying edge. What is it this time? More photographs, perhaps. We need to talk about the break-in, Gray said, his tone cutting through the veneer of civility. It seems someone took the evidence we found, photos, files. They've been stolen, Mr. Knox. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Knox's expression didn't change, but Craig saw the subtle flicker of tension in his jaw. It was a fleeting moment, but it was there. His eyes narrowed slightly. His lips pressed together as though he was considering his words carefully. Stolen, Knox said, his voice still too calm. I don't know what you're implying. I have no control over what happens at the station. Gray leaned in, his eyes never leaving Knox's. You can't afford to act like you don't know what's happening. These aren't random thefts. They're a deliberate attempt to stop us from connecting the dots. You know more about Collier's disappearance than you're letting on. And I think you're afraid that we're getting too close to the truth about you, Mr. Knox. The solicitor's face hardened, but he didn't break. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his hands folding on the desk. You're reaching, Detective. I have nothing to fear. I've already told you everything I know. If someone has taken those photos, you should be looking into your own team. Perhaps you have a mole on the inside. The accusation stung, but Gray didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed, his voice a razor's edge. Don't try to turn this around on us, Knox. We both know you have far more to lose than anyone here. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken truths. Craig could feel the walls closing in again. Knox was lying, he was hiding something, but there was something deeper than the theft of evidence. It wasn't just the photographs, the stolen files, or the corrupted footage. It was the fear in Knox's eyes when they first mentioned the break-in. Fear not just of being caught, but of something worse. Something buried in the past that was about to come to light. Gray's voice broke through the tension, calm but filled with determination. We'll find out the truth, Knox, and when we do, you'll wish you had told us everything from the beginning. Knox remained silent, but his eyes betrayed him. There was something in the way he avoided Gray's gaze, a crack in his steely resolve. The game was far from over, but this time, Craig felt the weight of the stakes pressing harder than ever before. Someone was actively working against them, someone who would stop at nothing to bury the truth, and with every piece of evidence slipping through their fingers, it was becoming clearer. The people they were up against weren't just criminals. They were far more dangerous. As they left Knox's office, Craig's heart was pounding. The case was spiraling in ways they hadn't anticipated, and someone in the shadows was always one step ahead. He wasn't sure who could be trusted anymore, but he knew one thing for certain. The truth wasn't just slipping away, it was being smothered by someone who knew exactly how to hide it. The days following their meeting with Knox were a blur of tension. The feeling of the ground slipping beneath Craig's feet had only grown stronger, and the case, once full of potential, now felt like a house of cards. Every step forward was matched with 2 steps back, and the more they uncovered, the more it seemed like someone was actively trying to shut them down. They had already lost the photos, someone had taken them from the evidence locker. And now, as they pushed deeper into the mystery, Craig couldn't shake the feeling that the whole case was slowly being erased. It was late into the evening when the phone rang again. Gray had been pacing in the small office, his gaze distant. As he went over the case files, Craig was flipping through the notes, trying to make sense of the discrepancies, when the sudden shrill of the phone made him jump. Gray picked it up, his voice businesslike. Craig watched as his partner's face tightened, his posture shifting from casual to alert. The detective spoke for a few moments, his answers clipped, before he hung up the receiver with a quiet click. That was the station, Gray said, his voice grim. Another break-in. This time, it's the security footage. The tape of last night where the thief was caught on camera, it's gone. Craig's stomach sank. It was as if the walls were closing in on them from all sides. How could someone get to that too? Corrupted, Gray muttered, his fingers running through his hair. The entire drive is wiped clean. Whoever's doing this is good, Craig, really good. And it's not just the photos anymore, Craig said, the weight of the realization hitting him like a hammer. It's everything. Whoever's behind this is trying to destroy the entire case. Gray didn't respond immediately. He stared at the files spread out on the desk, as if willing the pieces to make sense. There was a moment of silence, thick and uncomfortable, before he finally spoke. Again, we need to start looking at things from a different angle. Whoever is pulling the strings is trying to bury the truth before we can get to it. That means we're not just chasing a killer. We're chasing someone with enough power to manipulate everything around them. Craig rubbed his forehead, exhaustion creeping in. They were so close, hadn't they just uncovered the most important connection between Knox and Collier? But now, with every piece of evidence being systematically destroyed, Craig felt the weight of defeat creeping in. Was this the end of the road? Were they about to lose everything? We need to go back to the scene, Gray said suddenly, his voice cutting through Craig's spiraling thoughts. The murder site. Harper's study. There's something we missed. Something that wasn't in the police reports. I can feel it. Despite his growing frustration, Craig couldn't help but be drawn to Gray's unwavering determination. There was something about the way the detective approached the case, a calm certainty that cut through the noise, and it was that same certainty that had led them to this point, through the lies and the deceptions, that made Craig believe they weren't out of options just yet. I'll grab the car, Craig said, already moving to get his jacket. He wasn't sure what they were going to find, but something told him Gray was right. They had to go back. They had to take another look before the last pieces of the puzzle vanished entirely. The drive to Harper's mansion was silent, the headlights cutting through the mist that seemed to cling to the trees like a thick veil. By the time they arrived, the night was deep, and the mansion stood tall and silent, its windows like empty eyes, watching them as they made their way to the study. Gray moved through the house with the ease of someone who had been here before, his eyes scanning every corner, every piece of furniture as if it held the answers. Craig followed, feeling the chill of the place settle into his bones. They reached the study without incident. The door still ajar as it had been the first time, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was an odd stillness to the room, a sense of expectation, as if it were waiting for them to uncover something. Take a look at this, Gray said, his voice low, but filled with purpose. He pointed to the desk where Harper had once sat, now barren except for a few scattered papers. Craig moved closer, examining the surface. Everything appeared normal except for one thing, a small object, barely noticeable, tucked into the corner beneath a stack of papers. It was a button, a simple, silver button that seemed completely out of place in the otherwise tidy room. Is this? Craig started, but Gray was already crouched down, picking it up between his fingers. It's a button, Gray murmured, studying it closely. But it's not just any button. It's from a military uniform. Craig's pulse quickened. The find seemed insignificant at first, but now, as he saw the way Gray handled the button with such care, the importance became clear. A military button. It was an odd detail, one that didn't fit with anything they had uncovered about Harper or Knox, but it was a clue that tied back to something, someone who had a much darker connection to this whole mess. Whoever took this, took it on purpose, Gray said, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. They didn't just miss this button when they were cleaning the room. They knew it was there. It's a message. Craig's mind raced. The button didn't just belong to Harper. It was connected to something more, a military connection, something from Harper's past. But who would want to leave this behind? And more importantly, why? Do you think Knox was in the military? Craig asked, though the question felt more like a formality. No, Gray replied, shaking his head. But someone close to him might have been. Someone who has the means and the motive to bury everything, someone with a history Harper was trying to keep buried. Gray stood up, his eyes narrowing. This button, it's not just a mistake, it's a breadcrumb, and whoever's hiding the truth about Harper's death wants us to find it. Craig felt a flicker of hope in his chest. The case wasn't over, it wasn't lost, but it was only getting more dangerous. Whoever was behind the thefts, the tampering, and the cover-ups, whoever was orchestrating the destruction of their evidence, was starting to feel real. The stakes were rising, and the deeper they went, the more treacherous the path became. The truth was still out there, but now, more than ever, Craig knew they had to be careful. Someone was playing a far bigger game than they had ever imagined. The button, the missing evidence, and the tangled connections, everything was pointing toward a much larger conspiracy, one that was desperate to keep its secrets buried. The investigation wasn't over yet, but with every piece of evidence they uncovered, they were only getting closer to the truth and to those who would do anything to stop them from finding it. The ride back from Harper's estate was steeped in a silence that felt almost sacred. Craig sat beside Gray, the silver button still resting in his palm like a relic. Outside the car windows, the world was wrapped in fog, the street lamps little more than faint ghosts in the mist. Every bump in the road seemed to echo louder, every turn heavier, as though the truth itself had begun to stir beneath their feet. Back in the office, Gray spread the remaining case files across the table without a word. The photographs they had, the notes that hadn't been tampered with, the transcripts of interviews, each document was handled with reverent care. The detective's eyes scanned every line, every page, and Craig could see the tension in his shoulders begin to coil tighter. "What is it?" Craig finally asked, unable to stand the weight of the silence. "You see something?" Gray didn't answer at first. Instead, he reached for the original report from the scene of Harper's murder, the one compiled by the responding officer. It was hastily written, mostly procedural, and they'd passed over it dozens of times. But now, Gray was staring at a single sentence. "He made tea before he died," Gray murmured. "It says here the kettle was still warm when the housekeeper found the body." Craig blinked. "Yeah, so he made tea," Gray repeated, more to himself than to Craig. But Harper never drank tea. He was a coffee drinker always. According to his staff, he couldn't stand the taste of tea. His housekeeper even stopped keeping it in the house last year because he refused to touch the stuff. Craig felt the shift instantly. A small, ridiculous thing, tea, but Gray's tone had changed. His voice had the sharpness of a blade being unsheathed. "What if he didn't make the tea?" Gray asked quietly. "What if someone else did?" Craig's mind started turning. "You think the killer was there before Harper died? That he was making tea for someone else, maybe trying to calm them down or trying to buy time?" Gray said, "Distract him, stall him while something else was happening." He moved back to the crime scene photographs, zooming in on the desk. "And remember the way Harper's body was positioned? Slumped slightly to the right. Not like he collapsed, more like he was trying to get away from someone. But there was no sign of a struggle." Craig was already flipping through the interview notes from the staff again, scanning for any reference to visitors. "Then the question is, who was he trying to get away from?" Gray paused, his gaze landing on the transcript from an interview with Harper's driver, Lionel Davis. "He said something odd," Gray murmured. "Something we didn't pay attention to at the time." Craig followed his line of sight, reading the section aloud. "Mr. Harper was quiet on the drive home, unusually so. Didn't say a word, but when he stepped out, he told me not to come back until morning, said he'd be fine, just needed some peace and quiet." That wasn't like him. Gray looked up. That wasn't like him. Harper never stayed in that house alone overnight, not since the Collier incident. He was paranoid, kept extra security, always made sure someone was in earshot. So why would he dismiss his driver unless he was expecting someone he trusted? Craig's brow furrowed. "Knox, possibly," Gray said, "but that doesn't explain the tea. Knox is cold, calculating he wouldn't make tea in the middle of a murder. And if Harper was afraid of him, he wouldn't have let him in alone." Gray's eyes narrowed again, flipping through the photos until he landed on the study's bookshelf. But someone else was there. Someone Harper trusted enough to be alone with. Someone who had access to both Harper's and Collier's affairs. Someone who knew about the ledger, the missing funds, the panic, and who knew about the military past. Craig stared at the photo, the bookshelf, a row of antique novels on military history set neatly between two busts. Most were untouched except for one, the fourth book from the left, Battalion Honor, a memoir of service, had shifted just slightly, barely noticeable, but misaligned. "Hold on," Craig said, pointing. "That book. It's from a former commanding officer, someone decorated in the same regiment Harper once served in. Before his business career, we never thought to check his military connections." Gray's eyes lit up. Of course, the button, the book. It all makes sense. He turned, pacing now as he connected the threads aloud. The real connection wasn't just Knox or Collier, it was the third man. The silent partner. Someone Harper had known long before the business deals. Someone with ties to the military, who was never listed on paper because he didn't need to be. Craig felt the blood rush to his face. Harper's accountant, Gerald Penn. Gray snapped his fingers. Yes, he handled Harper's military pension files before transferring into corporate bookkeeping. That's how he knew everything. He'd been there from the beginning. Craig grabbed the personnel file they had barely skimmed earlier. He's been with the company for nearly 30 years. Background in financial forensics. But his military record is sealed. Gray nodded, the pieces falling into place rapidly now. He was the one behind the missing funds, the false entries in the ledger. Collier found out Penn made him disappear. Then Harper started catching on, grew paranoid. But Harper wasn't fast enough. But why take the risk of coming to Harper's house? Craig asked. Why not keep hiding in the background? Because Harper was going to confess, Gray said. He had the records, he'd started compiling them. That night, Penn came to convince him not to go through with it. And when Harper refused, he made tea. Craig said softly. He bought himself 5 minutes. Maybe he poisoned it, maybe not. But it wasn't enough. Harper saw through it. That's why he was trying to get away. They both stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the revelation heavy between them. Gerald Penn, a man who had quietly stood at the periphery of their investigation, bland and forgettable, but now, like the final piece of a jigsaw, snapping into place, he was there at the center, hidden in plain sight. Gray reached for his coat. We need to find him, now. Craig grabbed the keys, and this time, we don't let him slip through our fingers. As they walked out into the night, the fog had lifted slightly, and the city lights bled through like distant stars. The pattern had finally emerged, and with it, the beginning of the end. They had their suspect, and the chase after so many twists and buried lies was almost over. The rain had started falling as they drove toward Gerald Penn's last known address, a small, unremarkable flat in the less glamorous part of the city. The streets were slick, the light from the headlights scattering across puddles, and the world outside felt muted. Craig couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into the lion's den. The investigation had led them to this moment, to Penn. But the more they dug into the accountant's life, the more disturbing the motives seemed to become. I still don't get it, Craig said, breaking the silence. The money makes sense, the betrayal even. But why Harper? Why didn't Penn just cut ties with him quietly and walk away? Gray didn't answer immediately. His gaze locked on the road ahead. It wasn't until the car slowed, nearing the building, that he spoke. Penn didn't just want the money, Craig. He wanted control. But more than that, he wanted to erase something. Craig turned toward him, puzzled. Erase? The ledger was the key, Gray explained, his voice calm but intense. Harper's whole life was built on that business, those records. They were his legacy. But Penn didn't just want to steal the company from him. He wanted to destroy everything Harper had built, the lie he'd been living, the truth behind his so-called success. It was about control, yes, but more about the power to shape the story. Craig felt a shiver run down his spine. You're saying Penn wanted to rewrite history? Exactly, Gray said, eyes still focused ahead. Penn believed Harper was a fraud, that Harper never deserved his success, that the whole empire was built on manipulation, lies, and a violent past. Penn was trying to make things right. In his mind, at least. They parked outside the flat, the rain now coming down harder. The world outside seemed to press in on them, the tension in the air palpable. Craig could feel his pulse quickening as they approached the door. Penn was inside, and the truth, everything that had led to Harper's death, was about to be revealed. Gray knocked 3 times, his hand steady, but Craig could see the familiar flicker of anticipation in his partner's eyes. Penn had been the ghost in the case, the one who had slipped through their fingers every time, remaining hidden in plain sight. But now they were cornering him. There was no answer. Gray knocked again, this time louder, his patience clearly. Wearing thin, Craig felt his own nerves tighten, but he knew they were close, so close. He stepped forward, ready to break the door open when it swung inward with a quiet creak. Penn was standing in the doorway, his eyes wide, but his expression unreadable. He looked older than Craig had expected, tired, drawn, his hands trembling, slightly clenched at his sides. For a moment, neither man spoke. "We need to talk, Gerald," Gray said calmly, his tone unyielding. Penn stepped back, allowing them into the dimly lit apartment. The place was sparse, bare walls, a single worn-out armchair, a coffee table cluttered with papers. It looked like the home of someone who had lived with a single, consuming purpose for far too long. Craig glanced around, his gaze settling on a small stack of documents on the table. It was all too familiar, the same kind of records they'd found in Harper's study, filled with meticulous figures, dates, and names. "I'm not talking to you." Penn finally spoke, his voice raw, almost pleading. "You think you know everything, but you don't. You don't know what he did, what he was really doing." Gray stepped forward, his expression as cold as the rain outside. "We know what Harper was involved in, Penn, but this is about you, not him. This is about what you've been hiding." Penn's eyes flickered to the door, and Craig knew he was thinking of running, but there was no escape. The walls had already closed in on him. He couldn't outrun the truth. "You don't understand." Penn's voice cracked as he spoke. "I had no choice." He had to be stopped. Craig felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Stopped? Harper? Why?" Penn's lips quivered as he looked at the floor, and for a brief moment, Craig saw a glimpse of the man he truly was. It wasn't the cold, calculating accountant they had been chasing. It was a broken man, a man who had let guilt and shame drive him to this point. Penn looked up, eyes wide and desperate. He didn't deserve any of it. Penn shouted suddenly, his voice high-pitched with a strange, feverish intensity. "Not the success, not the money. He built his empire on the backs of men like me, men who fought for this country, men who died so he could sit in his office, pretending he earned it. He never earned it. He was a coward, a fraud. He needed to be exposed." Gray's face didn't change, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "So you killed him to expose him, to destroy the lie, not just expose him," Penn hissed. "To erase the legacy, to show everyone that Harper was nothing more than a thief, a criminal, a man who used his past to cover up who he really was. I wasn't going to let him continue to deceive everyone." Craig could hear the madness in Penn's voice now, the delusion, the distorted sense of righteousness. It wasn't just about money. It was about control, about taking the story of Harper's life and rewriting it the way Penn saw fit. To him, Harper wasn't just a business mogul. He was the embodiment of everything Penn had come to despise, a man who had risen above his station, through lies, manipulation, and an unearned reputation. "But why the murder?" Craig asked, his voice steady despite the horror settling in his chest. "Why did you have to kill him? Why not just expose him through the records?" Penn's laugh was hollow. "Because he wouldn't stop. He was going to tell the truth. He was going to destroy me, everything I'd worked for. He was going to expose my part in it all. And when he was about to confess, I knew I had to act. I couldn't let him ruin everything." Penn's hands shook as he clenched them into fists, his eyes wild with desperation. "You think I wanted to kill him? I didn't want to. But I had no choice. No choice but to end it before he ruined everything, before he ruined me." Gray's voice was quiet now, more like a whisper. "But you couldn't control the narrative. Could you? That's what this was about, wasn't it? Gerald, you couldn't let him be the one to tell his story, because you knew he would expose your lies." Penn's face twisted with fury and guilt. "He was going to expose me," he spat. "But more than that, he was going to expose the truth about the men he'd betrayed, the ones who fought and died for this country. He was nothing but a fraud, a criminal, and I had to stop him." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The true motive was revealed, and it was far more twisted than they had imagined. Penn's need for control, his desire to rewrite history, had led him to murder. It wasn't about the money or power, it was about erasing a legacy, and in the process, creating his own dot. As Gray and Craig moved to arrest him, Penn's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions finally crashing down on him. There was no escape now. He had revealed everything, and in doing so, had sealed his own fate. They walked out of the apartment in silence, the rain falling steadily round them. The truth had been uncovered, but it wasn't the victory they had hoped for. It was a sobering reminder of the lengths some people would go to rewrite their own narrative. The rain hadn't let up. It was pouring now, a relentless downpour that made the world outside feel distant and disconnected. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional passing car, its headlights flickering in the haze of the wet night. Inside the car, the atmosphere was thick with tension, and Craig could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. They had him Gerald Penn-cornered, exposed, but there was still a lingering sense of unease. Gray sat beside him, his eyes focused on the road, the silence between them heavy. Craig glanced at his partner, trying to gauge what was going through his mind, but Gray's face remained impassive, his expression unreadable. "You think he'll crack?" Craig finally asked, breaking the silence. Gray didn't answer right away. He pulled the car into the alley behind a small, unassuming office building. The lights dim and quiet. This wasn't the kind of place anyone would associate with power or danger, but Gray had chosen it deliberately. It was the perfect spot for a confrontation isolated, with no one around to witness what was about to unfold. "I don't think we'll need to crack him," Gray said, his voice steady, but there was something about the way he spoke that made Craig realize how much was riding on this. "We've already got what we need. He's not going to run." Craig wasn't so sure. Penn had proven to be slippery, elusive, and above all, desperate. But Gray was right about one thing: everything had led to this moment. The pieces were in place. The question now was whether Penn would fold under the pressure, or if there was one last trick he had up his sleeve. They parked the car and got out, moving quickly toward the rear entrance of the building. The door was locked, but Gray had already anticipated this. With one smooth motion, he produced a set of keys and unlocked it. They stepped inside. The faint hum of fluorescent lights, the only sound in the otherwise quiet hall. The office was bare, with a single desk and a few chairs scattered around. No personal touches, no decorations, just a sterile, clinical space perfect for business, but cold and empty. A single window overlooked the alley, casting a faint glow of city lights across the room. Penn was already inside, sitting at the desk, his hands clasped together tightly in front of him. He didn't look surprised when they entered. In fact, he seemed almost resigned to his fate. His shoulders were hunched, and his face, pale and drawn, gave away the exhaustion he had been carrying for so long. He wasn't the same man they had confronted earlier. He seemed smaller now, diminished, like a man who had fought a losing battle for too long. "Gerald," Gray said, his voice smooth, measured. "You know why we're here." Penn's eyes flickered, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the desk, his fingers tapping nervously. "You're wasting your time," he muttered, his voice almost drowned out by the steady rhythm of the rain against the windows. "I already told you everything. We both know that's not true," Gray replied calmly, taking a step closer. "You've been running this whole time, hiding behind lies, behind your so-called morals. But it's over now. You're not going to get away with it." Penn's eyes lifted to meet Gray's, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something close to fear in his gaze. But it didn't last long. He quickly masked it with defiance. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "I did what needed to be done. He had to be stopped. He was going to ruin everything. You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? You think you've got me cornered. But you don't." Gray's gaze didn't waver. "You're right. We don't have all the answers, not yet. But we will. We always do." Penn's lip curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You think I'm afraid of you. You think this little game is going to change anything." Craig stepped forward, his voice low. "You're not the first person to think they can control everything. You weren't the first person to think they could just erase the truth. But you'll be the last." Penn stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. His hands shook as they clenched into fists. "You don't get it," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I had to do this. You don't understand what Harper was. He was everything I hated, everything I fought against. He didn't deserve any of it. He was a fraud." Gray's eyes flicked to Craig, and Craig nodded slightly. The moment had arrived. The trap had been set, and it was about to close. Understand more than you think, Gerald, Gray said, his voice smooth, as if he were addressing a child. But here's the thing. You don't get to decide who lives and who dies. You don't get to decide who's a fraud and who isn't. You weren't in control. No matter how much you convinced yourself you were, you never were. Penn's eyes widened, the tension in his face giving way to something darker, more desperate. You think you've got the truth. You think you've figured it all out. You don't know anything. You don't understand what it's like to have someone take everything from you, to watch them destroy everything you worked for. I had no choice but to stop him. Gray stepped closer. You made a choice, Gerald. The moment you decided to end his life, you chose your path, and now there's no turning back. Penn's chest heaved as he looked around the room, like he was searching for an escape, but there was none. No door left open, no way out. His back pressed against the desk, and for the first time since they'd walked in, he seemed to shrink. His defiance faltered, replaced by an almost pleading look. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I never wanted this. I didn't want to kill him." But he wouldn't listen. He wouldn't stop. "I couldn't." "Enough," Gray interrupted. "It's over." Penn's head dropped, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his own confession settled on him. There was nothing left for him to say. No more lies, no more justifications. The man who had tried to rewrite the story of his life, to erase the one person who had stood as a reminder of his own failures, was finally cornered. And with that, he knew there was no escape. Gray moved in quickly, his hand firmly gripping Penn's arm, guiding him toward the door. The rain outside was still coming down hard, but inside, everything felt quiet. The final confrontation was over. As they walked out into the alley, the city seemed to exhale around them. Penn's story, the twisted truth behind his actions, had finally come to light, and with it, the case was closed. But the weight of it lingered, like a storm that had passed but left its mark on everything. Gray glanced at Craig, his face unreadable as always, but there was something in his eyes now, something that seemed almost like relief. "It's over," Gray said quietly. "But it never really is it?" Craig shook his head slowly. "No, it never really is." And as the rain continued to fall around them, they walked toward the car, leaving behind a man whose desperation had led him to make choices that would forever haunt him. The car had barely pulled away from the alley when Craig felt it, the uneasy sensation that something was still off. It wasn't the satisfaction of a case closed, or the weight of a final victory. No, this felt different. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, only to feel the ground beneath your feet shift. Gray didn't seem to notice, his attention fixed on the road ahead, but Craig couldn't shake the feeling. It was too clean, too simple. Penn's confession had been too easy. He had admitted everything. The motive, the lies, the murder, it had all made sense. But something gnawed at Craig's mind, an itch he couldn't scratch. "Gray," Craig said, his voice hesitant, "do you ever think we missed something?" Gray's hands tightened on the wheel, his fingers pale against the leather. "No," he said firmly, without looking at Craig. "We got it. It's over." Craig opened his mouth to argue, but then something strange happened. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a sudden interruption. He pulled it out, expecting another call from the station, maybe some final paperwork to finalize. But what he saw made his breath catch. It was a message, a simple text, with no name attached, just a number. But the content made Craig's heart skip a beat. "You think you've got the story right. You don't. Check the ledger again. All of it." It took him a moment to process what he was reading, and then another to pull up the digital copy of the ledger on his phone. He had been through it a dozen times, maybe more, but this time, as he scanned the entries, something leapt out at him. There it was, buried beneath the usual numbers, the familiar names, and entry, almost hidden, tucked away like it was deliberately ignored. "Gray," Craig's voice was urgent now, a tremor creeping into it. "Pull over." Gray glanced at him, his eyes narrowing, but he obeyed, slowing the car to the side of the road and stopping beneath the cover of an overhang. The rain continued to beat against the windshield as Craig leaned forward, his fingers trembling slightly as he zoomed in on the entry. The ledger was filled with familiar names: Harper, Collier, Knox, and Penn, but this one This name was unfamiliar, and yet it was there, buried in the middle of the financial documents, like it didn't belong. Who the hell is Thomas Carrington? Craig muttered, his mind racing. Gray glanced over at the phone. What about him? Craig could feel the weight of the realization settling on him. He's not in any of the reports. He wasn't mentioned in the case at all. But here he is, buried in the ledger, getting payments from Harper's accounts, regular payments. Over the last 5 years, Gray's expression hardened. That name doesn't ring a bell. Exactly, Craig said, already pulling up more details from the ledger. He dug deeper, tracing the payments, the amounts, and the dates. It was clear now. This wasn't just a name in passing, it was an investment, a connection, and it wasn't. In any of the reports, Carrington had been siphoning money directly from Harper's empire. But it didn't make sense. Why would someone like Harper, someone with so much at stake, leave this out? Get me the address for this guy, Craig said, his voice low. We need to talk to him. Gray reached for his phone, his hands suddenly moving faster than before. He knew, just as Craig did, that this case wasn't over. Not by a long shot. An hour later, they were standing in front of a dilapidated townhouse in a forgotten corner of the city. The building looked abandoned, like it hadn't seen the light of day in years. Craig felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he stared up at the cracked windows and peeling paint. Whoever Thomas Carrington was, he didn't look like someone with a stake in Harper's empire. Let's be careful, Gray muttered, his hand hovering near the gun at his hip. We don't know who or what we're walking into. Craig nodded, his mind racing. Everything was leading to this. Every clue, every twist in the investigation had pointed here. The final piece of the puzzle. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Gray tried the handle locked. Without hesitation, he stepped back and kicked the door in, the wood splintering easily beneath the force. Inside, the place was dark, the only light coming from a lone lamp that flickered ominously. The air smelled musty, stale, as if it had been sealed off for years. But the moment Craig stepped inside, he saw papers scattered across the floor, files strewn about, and in the center of it all, a figure hunched over a desk, scribbling furiously. Thomas Carrington, the man they'd been looking for. He looked up slowly, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. His hair was unkempt, and there was something in his gaze, something desperate. But what struck Craig most was the look of recognition that passed over Carrington's face when he saw them. You found me, Carrington said quietly, almost as if he had been waiting for this moment. I knew you would. Gray stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. You're Thomas Carrington. You've been receiving payments from Harper for years. Why? What's your connection to him? Carrington smiled faintly, a sad, bitter smile. Harper and I had a partnership, a business deal, but it wasn't about money. It was about something much more personal, much more dangerous. Craig's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? Harper wasn't just a businessman, Carrington said, his voice distant. He was a murderer. He had a secret he was willing to kill for. I was just the one who helped him bury it. Carrington stood slowly, his movements deliberate. I was his cleaner, his partner in crime. He didn't just make money off the legitimate side of his business. He made money off something far darker. What are you saying? Gray demanded, stepping closer. I'm saying, Carrington replied softly. Harper didn't die by accident. He knew the walls were closing in. He was going to confess, but not about the money, about the people he had killed to get it. The revelation hit like a tidal wave. Everything they had believed, everything they had worked for was being torn apart in that moment. Carrington looked at them with hollow eyes. Harper didn't just want to destroy people for power. He killed them to cover up a secret that would have destroyed everything he'd built. I was his accomplice, and when I saw him slipping, I knew the time had come to take control of the legacy. But you're too late. As he spoke, something dark and dangerous flickered behind his eyes, and for the first time, Craig realized the truth. Harper hadn't just been a man driven by ambition, he had been a man running from his past. And Carrington, he hadn't been a mere accomplice. He was the mastermind, the one pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The entire case had been a diversion, a smokescreen, and now, with the truth finally in their hands, it was clear the real game was just beginning. Carrington's. Words hung in the air like a bitter fog, clouding the room with their weight. The truth that had been obscured for so long was now bare, exposed in a way that felt almost unreal. Craig's mind raced, scrambling to make sense of it. Harper hadn't just been a businessman, a mogul caught in a tangle of lies and greed. He had been a murderer, a man hiding a history of bodies in the shadows. And Carrington had been his accomplice all along. But why? Why had they all been so blind? Gray took a step forward, his expression unreadable. You're telling us that Harper was a killer, and you were his partner in this charade? That he wasn't just covering up the money, but people's lives, and you think we're supposed to just believe you? Carrington's face twisted, and for the first time, there was a hint of real emotion, guilt, maybe, or fear etched into his features. You don't get it, he said, his voice rising. Harper was a monster, but I wasn't any better. I helped him cover it up. I was the one who made sure no one found out. I knew everything about the people he murdered, the families he destroyed, and I was paid to keep it all quiet. Gray's voice dropped to a near whisper. Who did he kill? Carrington faltered, looking away. I can't. He broke off, his eyes darting nervously around the room. You don't understand what you're asking. These people, these lives, they were the price Harper paid to get ahead, to build his empire. Craig stepped forward, his gut telling him they were close, closer than they'd ever been. He didn't know how, but they had finally found the missing piece. He leaned in, speaking in a calm, measured tone. You're not going to get away with this, not this time. You're going to tell us everything. Every name, every deal, all of it. Carrington took a shuddering breath. For a moment, it seemed like he might give in. He opened his mouth, as if to speak, but then, with a sudden, terrifying swiftness, he moved toward the desk. Before either of them could react, Carrington grabbed something off the table, something small and metallic, and held it to his side. A gun. Gray's hand went to his holster instinctively. But Carrington's eyes were wild now, his entire body trembling, with a mixture of panic and fury. You think you've won? He sneered, backing toward the corner of the room. You think I'm just going to roll over and hand you the truth on a silver platter? You've got no idea what you're dealing with. Craig's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. Put the gun down, Carrington. This doesn't need to end like this. But Carrington was beyond reason now. He had already seen too much slip through his fingers. His empire built on lies and violence was collapsing around him. The walls were closing in, and he knew it, his face contorted with desperation. You don't know who you're messing with, he spat. I made Harper. I'm the one who kept him in line. I'm the one who kept you from finding out the truth. But now you think you've got it all figured out? Before Craig could answer, Carrington moved in a blur, darting for the back door. But Gray was faster, in a single, fluid motion. He grabbed the gun from Carrington's hand and slammed him against the wall, pinning him there with a force that took the wind out of the man's lungs. You're done, Gray said, his voice calm, but with a steely edge that made Carrington's body go slack. No more running. Carrington struggled for a moment, but his strength had already evaporated. He slumped to the floor, breathing heavily, as if the fight had gone out of him. The gun, now safely out of his grasp, lay discarded on the floor between them. Craig knelt beside Carrington, his gaze cold. You had every chance to end this peacefully, but now you've forced our hand. You're going down, Carrington, and everything you've done will come out. Everything. Carrington looked up at him, his expression broken. I didn't have a choice, he muttered, barely audible. Harper, he made me do it. He had dirt on me, on all of us. Who? Gray demanded, tightening his grip on Carrington's collar. Who else was involved? But Carrington's gaze drifted to the side, his eyes clouding with something. That could have been regret or fear, something that suggested there was still more to the story. You're too late, he whispered. You'll never get to the heart of it. Harper, he wasn't the only one who buried bodies. He wasn't the only one who made deals in the dark. Craig felt the weight of those words settle heavily in his chest. He knew what Carrington was implying. There was still more, so much more that had been left unsaid. This wasn't just about Harper. It was about an entire network of corruption, a system of power built on the destruction of lives. And now, it seemed that Carrington was the last one standing in their way. But before either of them could press further, the sound of distant sirens filled the air. Gray stood up, pulling Carrington to his feet. The man's shoulders slumped in. "Defeat, it's over," he said again, but this time there was no satisfaction in his voice, only the realization that this was far from done. Hours later, back at the station, everything seemed to fall into place: the confession, the ledger, the gun, all of it. But as they went through the motions processing Carrington, taking down statements, going over evidence, something still nagged at Craig. The faces of the victims haunted him, the names in the ledger, the ones that never made it to the press, the ones Carrington had tried so hard to erase. They thought they had it all figured out, but there were cracks, subtle and unnoticed, in the story they had so carefully pieced together. Craig couldn't shake the feeling that the case wasn't over, not truly. No one had the full picture. Not yet. As the last report was filed, Gray stepped into the room. He didn't say anything at first, but Craig could see the same thought in his eyes, the same unease that had been creeping into his own. "You feel it too, don't you?" Craig asked. Gray didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the pile of case files, the stack of evidence, and the names that were still waiting to be revealed. Finally, he sighed. "Yeah, but we're one step closer. Just don't think this is the end." It wasn't. Not by a long shot. There were too many loose ends, too many unanswered questions. The truth had come out, but not the whole truth. And as they watched the rain continue to fall outside the window, Craig knew that this case, like so many others, was far from over. The wheels of justice had turned, but the final chapter had yet to be written. The station was quiet when Craig finally left, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the only sound breaking the silence. He had filed his last report, made sure everything was squared away, and yet there was no closure. Not in the way he had expected. Gray was already in the car when Craig stepped outside, his figure outlined in the soft glow of the streetlights. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy in the sky, threatening to spill once more. The city, now slick with rain, felt colder than usual, the air thick with the faint scent of wet concrete. Craig paused for a moment, taking it all in. He had solved the case. They had taken down Carrington, and Harper's twisted legacy was beginning to unravel. But something wasn't sitting right. It felt like they were on the edge of something bigger, something yet to be discovered. The case had been wrapped up, but the truth was far messier than they had realized. "Something's not right," Craig said as he slid into the passenger seat beside Gray. "I can't put my finger on it, but it's still there, like there's a piece missing." Gray didn't respond immediately. He just started the car, the engine growling to life. The hum of the tires on wet roads filled the space between them. "You're not the only one thinking it," Gray said quietly after a moment, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "We've got Carrington, but it's never just one person. Harper wasn't working alone. And Carrington, he's too smart to have been the only mastermind." Craig turned his head to look at his partner. His curiosity piqued. "You think there's more?" Gray didn't answer right away, but Craig could see the tension in his shoulders. He was thinking, weighing the possibility, and Craig knew that look. It was the one that came when a case wasn't over, when there were still questions lingering. The car made its way through the empty streets, passing darkened storefronts and silent alleyways. The world outside seemed distant, isolated, a perfect reflection of the way Craig felt, disconnected, as if the case was still pulling him in different directions. As they neared the edge of the city, Gray suddenly spoke up again. "We've been missing something. There's a message Carrington left us, a clue that he thought would keep us from seeing the bigger picture." Craig felt a chill run down his spine. A message? What kind of message? Gray reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He handed it over to Craig, who unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the words. It was brief, just a few words, hastily scribbled in pen. "Not done yet. You're not the only ones watching." Craig frowned, turning the paper over as if expecting more. But there was nothing else, just those 5 words. Who was he talking about? Craig asked, his mind working quickly. "We've already pulled him in. He's confessed." Gray shook his head. "That's just it. Carrington wasn't trying to warn us about himself. He was trying to tell us that we're still in the dark. There's someone else out there, someone connected to all of this. We've only seen the surface. Craig, the real players haven't even been revealed yet. Craig's mind raced, the pieces falling into place in a way that felt both thrilling and unsettling. So what now? We go back to the beginning. Gray's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he maneuvered the car through another sharp turn. Maybe, but I think we need to start looking at who Carrington was involved with. There were too many moving parts. He didn't act alone, and Harper wasn't the mastermind. I'm sure of it. The car made its way down the winding road that led out of the city, the streetlights gradually thinning until they were replaced by the dark shadows of the surrounding forest. Craig felt a nagging pull in his gut, the sensation that the real mystery was still waiting for them to uncover it. Carrington's confession wasn't the truth, Gray continued. Not all of it. He was too scared. He wanted to make sure. He was the last piece we looked at, the one that seemed to make sense. But he left us breadcrumbs, those cryptic lines in the ledger, the strange references to Harper's past, and that message. It's just the beginning. Craig's grip on the paper tightened. The message had been clear, but it still didn't explain everything. Who was watching them? Who was behind it all? He had thought this case was closed. He had thought he understood the full scope of what had happened. But now it seemed like the real story was just beginning. As the car turned onto a darkened highway, Craig found his thoughts drifting back to the small, cryptic details, those fragments that didn't quite add up, the strange connections in the ledger, the references to people who hadn't been mentioned in any of the reports. And then, that final message from Carrington. The truth was there, buried just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. But Craig had learned long ago that every case, no matter how resolved it seemed, always left something behind. A piece of the puzzle that wouldn't fit, a lingering doubt, a question that gnawed at the back of your mind. The city faded behind them, and the road stretched out ahead, endless and uncertain. Craig leaned back in his seat, his mind still spinning. The investigation had been everything he had expected, full of twists, turns, and unexpected revelations. But now there was a sense that the game wasn't over, that the questions would never fully be answered. Gray, Craig said, his voice low. You ever get the feeling that we're just one step behind? Gray glanced over at him, his face set in stone, every case. But you know that already. Craig nodded, a half smile tugging at his lips despite the weight of it all. He knew it was true. There would always be more. Always another case, another mystery, another unknown just waiting to be solved. The truth had come, but it hadn't come completely. And as the car moved through the darkened streets, Craig couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that this case, this mystery was far from over. The detective's work was never done, and neither was the hunt. As the headlights cut through the darkness, Craig knew the next case was already waiting, just beyond the horizon.